welcome to On the Media's very first live stream ever.
Good afternoon, I'm Joe Baker, a member of the Delaware Tribe of Indians.
Hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of Punishment and Profit, an educational webinar series about the prison industry presented by Worth Rises and the Green Space. I'm Bianca Tylik, founder and executive director at Worth Rises, a nonprofit organization that works to dismantle the prison industry and end the exploitation of those it touches. Today, we're talking about programs and labor in the prison industry. Though perhaps we should flip the order, since prisons and jails often prioritize labor over programs. We'll hear more about that shortly, but to get us started, let's learn a few important facts about the sector.
Despite claims that prisons are intended to rehabilitate people, programs often take a backseat to labor. Why? My name's Bianca Tylik. I'm the executive director at Worth Rises, and here are 5 facts you should know about programs and labor in the prison industry. When legislators moved to abolish slavery in 1865, they agreed to an exception meant to retain control over the black labor force that allows for enslavement as punishment for a crime. Most incarcerated workers are paid just pennies an hour, though 5 states pay nothing at all. Altogether, over $14 billion in wages are stolen from incarcerated workers every year. Most people in prison are required to work, and those who refuse can be denied calls, visits, care packages, and even put in solitary confinement. More than 90% of incarcerated workers work for the government, keeping prisons and jails running, as well as manufacturing license plates, harvesting produce, fighting wildfires, and more. Very few major corporations still use prison labor directly, like 3M, but many participate up and down the supply chains of products made through prison labor. Learn more with the curriculum at worthrises.org.
60 seconds, and if you didn't catch it all, don't worry. We'll be covering much of that tonight. And you can always go watch it again at Worth Rises on Twitter or Instagram. So let's hop into tonight's show. A little later, we'll be talking to Amani Sohari, Kamau Allen, and Andrew Free. But first, I'd like to introduce Jorge Renaud. Jorge is the Southwest Regional Director of Policy and Advocacy at Latino Justice. In 2020, he was the poet in residence at the Civil Rights Corps. Previously, Jorge worked with the Center for Community Change and the Prison Policy Initiative. Jorge spent a collective 27 years incarcerated in Texas, which has informed his work as a writer, poet, and activist. Jorge, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bianca. I'm really glad to be here.
Jorge, in the nearly 3 decades you were incarcerated in Texas, you saw programs take a backseat to labor over and over again. And in that structure, you worked many different jobs. Can you just start us off by explaining what prison labor really looks like and feels like? What are the different types of jobs that you and others had, and how much did you get paid?
To be totally fair here, I can only speak for Texas, right? Other states may be different, but in Texas, correctional guards perform 3 functions, right? They turn keys, they pass out mail, and they count. That's it. So imagine 109 prison units, right, with maybe 150, 160,000 incarcerated individuals, right, and everything that has to be done to run those units, right, from the laundry to the kitchen to the cleaning up, to the maintenance to the electrical work. Incarcerated individuals drive the trucks, they drive the tractors. They're the ones that work out in the fields that do the field work. They're the ones who pick the cotton. Yes, we still pick cotton in Texas prisons. Some of the stuff that I did, I spent 13 years in the fields picking cotton and chopping trees. And I spent time as a law library clerk, and I spent time as a commissary clerk, and I spent time as a kitchen clerk. And I made 27 years. I made, let me see, zero amount of money. Actually, they gave me a bus ticket to the place where I was paroling to, and they gave me a $50 check for, I don't know, to kind of grease the skids back into the free world. Yeah. So yeah, it's like everything that you can imagine that has to be done in order to run a prison or to run any sort of institution, right? Has to be done by individuals who were incarcerated. Everything.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you for sharing, obviously, your story. And so, as you were noting, right, most states actually pay people a few pennies an hour, and Texas is one of the few states that still doesn't pay incarcerated workers at all. Though, let's be clear, prison living is far from free. I mean, you pay for everything from medical co-pays to calls with your family and things of that sort. But the abuse inherent in prison labor is about more than fair pay. Or even, rights for employees. Prison administrators actually use labor to manipulate, subjugate, and degrade people. You once told me about a time when you lost a somewhat coveted clerical job because you refused orders. What was it that you were asked to do, and what were the consequences?
Yeah, I was a clerk in a hospital in like 82, 83, and I was the evening clerk, right? Which was, a really nice job. You could work out in there, you could sleep in there, you could read in there, you could do a lot of stuff, right? And one evening, somebody pounds on the door, and I go open the door, and it's the assistant warden, and he and a couple of guards are dragging somebody in. The guy's, knocked out, there's blood all over him. And the doctor comes running out and says, "What happened to him?" And the warden says he got hit with a big black stick. So they took him in the back, right in one of the cells back there, and they locked him up. And the doctor, to his credit, called the hospital, in Huntsville, and said, "Look, escort him down there to be sure they don't kill him on the way to the fence." Right. So I did that. I came back, and later on, after a couple of hours, they came to me and said, "Here's what you're supposed to put on the incident report." Right. That he fell down the steps, that he did all this stuff, and I'm like, "Well, I'm not going to do that. I mean, that's not what happened to him." And they go, "Yeah, you're going to do that." "No, I'm not going to do that." Well, then they said, "Okay, go to the house." So I went to the house, to the cell, of course. And the next morning I cut out with 2-0, which is the number 2 field force, right? It was, it's pretty analogous, I think, to the slavery when you look at field hands and, house hands or whatever, right? And if you displease the master, then you get put back out in the fields and pick up. So that's pretty well what I mean. And it happens all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah. I think, and I'm so, it's so great to see you and just like always things, because we know each other so well. But just to see, obviously, like the joy and know that this like system didn't break you in those ways, but to have that comparison, right, from slavery to your experience in the system of, as you said, field hands, house hands, and still seeing the master in that way sort of, threaten you, right, in that job. And to say, if you don't write what we said happened, right, as we abuse people and beat people and degrade people, we're going to put you back out in the field. It's really, I think, remarkable, and I hope that's sitting with people. And so, Jorge, today you're doing really powerful work to free people in Texas. But as I understand it, many of these folks who have been granted parole on the condition of completing a program, for them that program isn't actually available. Meanwhile, they obviously continue to work. So how is that possible? How is it that people have been granted parole and yet can't actually get out of prison because of some program that isn't available to them that they have to complete in order to leave? And I guess also the other bottom line is that, are these programs that are required for release even doing any good?
Oh, great questions, man. In May of last year, we found out there was something like 15,000 people in Texas, in TDCJ, right, Texas Department of Criminal Justice, who had been granted parole and were waiting programs to be released. We contacted about 4,000 of them, with a survey, trying to build a kind of a base so that we could tuck people inside. And meanwhile, during that interim, right, 9 people died in TDCJ who'd been granted parole and couldn't access programs. So of course, I wrote TDCJ and I said, look, there's no real good in-depth information that's accessible on your website? Do you mind telling me, some of these things that we think are necessary for us to determine the efficacy of the programs, right? Do you have any independent evaluations? All this stuff, right? So they wrote me back and said, no, Jorge, you have to file FOIA, right? FOIA is Freedom of Information Act, right? So I said, well, any nonprofit out here or that is providing services and gets government funds, has to do quarterly reports, very transparent. What makes you different? Again, I'm asking you for it, file a FOIA. Okay, we file a FOIA. Last week, they denied the FOIA. So yeah, they're not going to tell us what's in the programs. And I did some further research, and for the 4 biggest programs, Texas is putting out $65 million a year, right? We don't know, and like you illustrated very well in y'all's great report, right? That came out late last year about the programs. We don't know what the programs are, although I have a cadre of about 10 people I'm talking to who just got out that are telling me that the programs last year, right, the 5 months program they went in, that the only time the counselor came in was to tell them, here's a progress report, fill it out, right? So we also filed a bill asking for the same thing. So I don't know where we're going to get with that. And you mentioned something about them still working. Yes, until you get transferred off your unit and go to the privately run prison to take the program that's given you most likely by Gateway, that's a private vendor, right? You're going to perform your job up until the day that you get shipped. And if you have to stay on your unit and you're taking one of these other smaller programs, you're also going to continue your work. It's not like you're going to take the program. So yeah, that's pretty well where that is. And we may or may not be involved in some litigation here with TCJ behind this pretty stuff.
Well, I really hope that moves forward. I mean, it's really remarkable to think that there are people that have been, as I said, granted parole, are required to take some program before they can be released. And then that program isn't available to them, but the state is paying, as you said, $65 million a year for these programs, and in many cases to private vendors, and the public's not even allowed to know what these programs are, why they're required, and why people are not being released from facilities. And I think, the saddest stories we hear now during COVID are people who have been granted parole, and while they're awaiting parole are still inside and die from COVID. And so, I think, Jorge, thank you for the incredible work you're doing. To learn more about Jorge's work, please follow Latino Justice at Latino Justice and Jorge at Renata Antonio on Twitter. A quick reminder that if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please feel free to use the chat function to pose questions to any of our guests. You can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag #PunishmentProfit. Our next guest is Amani Sawari. Amani is a writer and the founder of Sawari Media. In 2019, she started and led the Right to Vote campaign as a civil rights fellow at the Roddenberry Foundation to restore the right to vote for people with criminal convictions. Amani also served as the national spokesperson for Jailhouse Lawyer Speaks during the 2018 National Prison Strike, the largest organized prison strike in U.S. history. Amani, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all for having me and for organizing this amazing event.
So you're one of my personal heroes, and I'm so excited to have you on today. Let's talk about the 2018 National Prison Strike, one of the most important organizing moments in recent history. This was a strike led by incarcerated people, but you played a major role in amplifying their demands, their needs, their voices on the outside. Tell us about that experience, how the strike came about, who was involved, what did the strike look like, and how did folks work around the inherent limitations of being incarcerated to organize together?
So the 2018 National Prison Strike was a monumental event. To date, it's the largest organized prisoner resistance movement in history. And it happened all under the organizing power of incarcerated people with the support of outside organizers like myself, grassroots folks on the ground, family members. So it took all moving parts and angles in order to make this happen. But without incarcerated organizers, it wouldn't be something that we're looking back on, talking about, and reflecting on today. What made it come about was violence in the prisons, the conditions in South Carolina's prisons, particularly. In April of 2018, there was a prison riot, as some call it, but I call it, and many others call it, a prison massacre, where a lot of people lost their lives. It's recorded that 7 prisoners lost their lives as a result of the massacre. And what happened was people on the inside were moved into gladiator fights, gladiator switches. And so how that happens is staff will move people in prison from spaces that they're comfortable in, groups that they're comfortable in, into other spaces, and switching up those groups during a lockdown in particular. And so they switched up the groups, put everyone on lockdown for 23 hours a day on end, and then that naturally caused conflict, caused fights. After a period of time, people started fighting, staff neglected these fights, and then people started to die hour on hour on hour. 9 hours passed. 7 men lost their lives at Lee County Correctional Facility in South Carolina. And as a result of that, people were on the inside trying to figure out what can we do in order to raise our voices and make sure that nothing like this happens again. So it was the Lee County Prison Massacre that happened that really ignited that flame. And then people started organizing in order to stop anything like that from happening again. So gladiator switches can happen in any state at any time. And so understanding that prisoners took power into their own hands in order to stop that from happening again. They got onto the phones. It started with jailhouse lawyers, which is a position that is in every prison facility. There are paralegals that are also incarcerated that help their comrades with divorce cases, custody battles, even appeals. And so these jailhouse lawyers decided to take it upon themselves to go the extra mile to do activist and organizing work. And so they started collaborating with one another. They whittled their conditions down to 10 demands, and then they recruited me. And I actually got an inbox on Twitter asking if I would amplify their demands. Little beknownst to me, people were following me on the inside. They were following my writings on sawarime.org, and that's why they selected me to be their spokesperson. I was honored to take the task, and from that April all the way through August, we were organizing, we were posting the demands, we were collecting endorsements, and we were able to go from having, it started off with Millions for Prisoners Human Rights Coalition, the Jailhouse Lawyers Speak organization, and Sawari Media, and building that up to over 350 endorsing organizations worldwide. And that included businesses, grassroots groups, and political candidates, a lot of folks in the Green Party, but people all over the spectrum, even as far as Greece, Palestine. We had prisoners writing from Israeli prisons in Palestinian prisoners that were writing in saying that they were also doing this in solidarity, hunger striking in solidarity. And what it looked like really depended on the conditions of the individual, what privileges and what restrictions they had. So someone could participate in one of 4 ways, and that was first work strikes, where a prisoner would refuse to go into work. We saw work stoppages where they just said, hey, we're not going to go into work today. And then there were sit-ins where prisoners would gather in a common area, sit down quietly, not speak, and just hold space. And then for folks who were unable to be in common spaces, they could boycott. And so a lot of folks did this in states where they boycotted commissary. They refused to get on the phones because that costs money. And they really wanted to make sure that the prison noticed a reduction in their income as a result of prisoners gathering and uniting together. And then the final and more universal tactic that people participated in, regardless of if they were in general population, regardless of if they were in solitary or what their restrictions were, was hunger striking. And so that's refusing to participate in eating, refusing to take your meal. And those were the 4 ways that people participated in the National Prison Strike of 2018.
Thank you so much for all that. And And that's it's such an interesting and beautiful story about how they like found you in particular, right? So my understanding is there was 17 states that ended up participating across the country. And so that was just such an incredible feat. So let's talk about their demands for just a second. So two of these demands related to actually prison programs and labor, which we're talking about today. Demand number 2 was an immediate end to prison slavery and payment of prevailing wages for work, and demand 8 was funding for rehabilitative programs. It's telling to me, right, that the demand amount around labor actually came earlier in the list, more prevalent in people's lives, and that the other demand was we just need more of rehabilitative program. We just don't actually have any. Can you actually explain, just from your words and from your conversations with the jailhouse lawyers and others, the importance of these two demands?
Yes. So demand number 2, so high up there when it comes to what people in prison were asking for and demanding and calling out in our country, an end to prison slavery. I think that prior to the 2018 National Prison Strike, the common person did not understand that slavery was still happening. And so really calling out and making it clear that we still have slavery going on in this country in every single state where we have prisons, whether they're getting paid nothing, as Jorge mentioned before, or getting paid pennies on the dollar. We know in Angola, they're picking cotton for 2 cents an hour. In places like Michigan, they're getting paid $40 a month to train seeing eye dogs. So it really doesn't matter that they're getting paid something. A lot of people will say, oh, they're getting paid something. That's not slavery. If you're not getting paid a living wage, then it's slavery. If you can't cover the cost of living, if you can't support your family, if you can't send your children to college, if you can't buy them clothes, if you can't buy a coat in the winter so that you can stand in line on the phone outside, then you're still in slave conditions. And so that demand number 2 is so high up there and such a priority because it is very important that we make it clear that slavery is something that's still happening in our country. And so whether they're getting paid something or not, that was why demand number 2 is so prevalent, such a priority. And then moving down to demand number 8, once we reprioritize and think about, okay, now we need to pay people in prison a living wage. What are we going to do with the resources that we're allocating in the prisons now? What is prison actually for? Is it for just exploiting labor, or is it for actually making sure that we can push someone from poverty into a place of, dare I say it, wealth, or at least into a place of sustenance where they can support themselves? If we can fund programs that are actually beneficial, that are actually useful, that people can actually use and take advantage of so that they can advance themselves in life, no one should enter prison and then leave in a lower position. But that's exactly what prison is designed to do, not to equip you to advance in life. And so that's another thing that our comrades were organizing around, is making sure that there's actual funding allocated, and a substantial amount of funding allocated for programming for people in prison. And I also want to highlight demand number 7 a little bit, because it also touches on programming. No denial to having access to rehabilitative programs just for being labeled a violent offender. There are many states where if you're labeled a violent offender, you're not even allowed to take certain classes and programs, which is mind-boggling. If you're in prison, it's because you need access to these programs. To give someone a label that disqualifies them really exposes how broken and corrupt our system is.
Yeah, it makes absolutely no sense, right? That you would think that, oh, somebody, has committed a particular offense, and so now we aren't going to offer them programs of any sort. I mean, it's, as you said, it exposes, right, the truth of this system. So we have just really 30 seconds here, Amani, and I want to just ask you really quickly, like, of course, the organizers didn't necessarily accomplish everything they had set out to with the strike, and not every single demand was met. We know that many of these horrors still exist in our society right now, but there were real wins. So in these last few seconds, can you just tell us, what were some of the most critical outcomes that you saw from the prison strike, and what's next?
So while we didn't see all the demands fully materialize in those 2.5 weeks, we did see a lot of successes, as you said, Bianca. We were able to have 17 bills introduced that following year in 2019 towards ending felony disenfranchisement. And to date, we've already seen ACA 6 in California pass, which allows people on parole to vote. We've seen the bill passed in New Jersey that allows people to vote while they're on probation and parole. And then we've also seen, as a result of boycotts, phone charge costs go down in Michigan and Texas. But aside from these business and political changes, we were able to see a lot of progress in the way that people think about what people in prison are capable of and what their role is in this movement. It's not just that, you know, we look at them and then we try to figure out how we can fix it for them. They actually have the position and the authority of taking the lead on this, and we can see the most progress when they do take the lead in this arena. Mainstream media caught onto the strike. We heard Vox reporting on it, ABC 15 News. We heard Democracy Now! Report on it twice, USA Today, BBC. So mainstream media took it on. And then I also did touch on presidential candidates because it was exciting to see Bernie Sanders actually take on a prisoner's Bill of Rights under his platform that touched on all of the demands, especially when it came to improving prisoner conditions and also restoring voting rights and everything around the demands. So we're seeing that conversation on a political level advance substantially. And just to see that on a presidential platform during this past race was significant. And so those are some of the successes that I'll fit into this time right now.
Amani, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for all the work you've done to amplify the voices of those within. We'll see you at the end of the show. To learn more about Amani's work, please follow Sawari Media at Sawari MI and www.righttovote.report. I just have to say that this week's guests are some of my personal heroes, as I was saying about Amani and some of the folks that we have still coming up, and Jorge, organizers who are doing groundbreaking work in the right way. And so here's another, Kamau Allen. Kamau is a community organizer with Together Colorado and the acting director of the Abolish Slavery National Network. In 2018, he helped lead a grassroots campaign that successfully abolished slavery in Colorado's constitution. After Colorado's win, Kamau helped build the Abolish Slavery National Network, a network of state and federal campaigns working to abolish slavery in every state constitution and the U.S. Constitution. Welcome, Kamau.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very excited to be here today.
Kamau, throughout the night, we've heard prison labor consistently described as slavery, and many comparisons made. At the very, core of what we're seeing inside of our prisons and jails, many might find this confusing because history books tell us that slavery was abolished in 1865 with the passage and state ratification of the 13th Amendment. But it turns out that the 13th Amendment didn't actually abolish slavery. Can you explain?
Yeah, so this was actually one of the most common questions that we got in Colorado, and when this measure was run later in Nebraska and Utah. So many people were actually contacting us asking, what do you mean slavery is still legal here in the United States, much less in Colorado, of all places? But the truth is, Bianca, the slavery was never abolished in the United States. It was simply reformed. And what we started to see with the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution is that it, in some form or in some ways and another, it did address chattel slavery, but by making slavery acceptable as punishment for a crime, it reformed it. It reallocated what it meant for slavery to be constitutionally allowed. And so what we began to see happen after that are two things. On the constitutional side of things, we saw so many states adopt similar or identical language to the 13th Amendment. And so states like Colorado that weren't even a part of the Union before the Civil War now had had a pro-slavery loophole embedded within its constitution. Now, there are a whole bunch of states that don't mention anything about slavery, but they automatically defer to what's in the 13th Amendment. So immediately after the passage of this amendment at the federal level, we saw from coast to coast, state after state after state adopt similar language, and slavery was constitutionally embedded back into our society.
Oh, sorry, excuse me.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and to be clear about the loophole, right, just so that people understand, the specific loophole of the 13th Amendment, right, states that slavery is abolished except to the extent that it can be used for punishment as for a crime.
Exactly. And what we find is that words matter, because when that was written into the 13th Amendment, the impact was not only just, constitutional mimicry, but what we saw was the passage of laws, the passage of policy that took full advantage of this loophole and stretched it as widely as it could. We saw the rise of convict leasing. We saw generations of Black people in the South who were re-enslaved under the laws that were constitutionally allowed.
Right.
And so right now we have a constitution that, if a law were to be written to say, we're going to put incarcerated people on auction blocks, that would be constitutionally allowed. And the legacy of this is what we witnessed with Jorge's story and with Amani Sawari's story. The legacy of this has impacted my own family, where so many members of my family have been incarcerated, but one of them in particular was incarcerated for so long and worked for so long and so hard that his body began to break down as a result of the labor. And he died from his injuries and his sickness about 3 years after his release. So the legacy of this is.
Wow. Thank you, Kamal, for sharing that story. And I'm terribly sorry for your family's obviously suffering under this existing regime of slavery. But I think what's incredible is the work that you're doing now, right? Because you're working to unfold this, and you helped lead the first successful modern day campaign to truly abolish slavery in 2018 in Colorado. And since then, Nebraska and Utah have also abolished slavery just in this last year. As a fellow member of the Abolish Slavery National Network core team, I'm really excited about what's coming up in the pipeline. Can you share what a campaign to abolish slavery really looks like and what's next?
Absolutely. Bianca, I am so happy to have you on the core team for the Abolish Slavery National Network. So I was very, very fortunate and blessed to be able to lead the campaign in 2018 in Colorado. However, that's not where the story began. I actually always try to start this story by paying honor and homage to our ancestors. I believe abolition started the moment that our ancestors were put in chains. And so with that being said, this is the latest iteration of what it means to abolish the legal provisions of slavery. And so in Colorado in 2016 by a good friend of mine who used to work at Together Colorado named Jamoki Emery. He was one day arrested at gunpoint right outside of our job. And he spent about 3 nights and 3 days in the county jail. That's when he started to get this idea for this campaign, and he began to ask questions about whether or not the pro-slavery loophole exists in Colorado's Constitution as it exists in the US Constitution. And so he brought that back to the organization, and the organization, Together Colorado, decided that we're gonna try to put this on the 2016 ballot, and that was gonna be the best way to address that in Colorado. So we didn't have the money for petitions and to get it on the ballot through there. So We got it on the ballot through the legislature, and it was unanimous both among Republicans and Democrats in both chambers. They both supported this, and so from there, it was all about ground game and doing the work of ballot measure initiatives. But what we're beginning to see, especially from the last two states in Nebraska and Utah that abolished slavery in 2020, is that most of the states connected to the national network are doing this revolutionary work through the ballot. And many of them are trying to go through the legislature. So there were quite a few similarities already between Colorado, Nebraska, and Utah, but we're also seeing that take place in other states as well.
Well, one of the exciting similarities, right, is that these are states across the political spectrum, right? This isn't what you would normally think of liberal or progressive states. These are red states. And that is remarkably exciting, right? Kamau, I'm going to drive us into the last sort of question just because we're running a little short on time. Really quickly, there's going to be folks who ask, right? In Colorado, Nebraska, Utah, did anything change, right? Once these ballot initiatives and these constitutions were changed. And, in many ways, right, the reality is that we still have people inside being forced to work. And so I'm curious sort of why is it important to pass these constitutional amendments? Can you tell us in just 60 seconds?
Yeah, so this represents the first of many steps that needs to happen. Abolishing slavery and involuntary servitude from the Constitution is not enough to actually abolish the practice of prison slavery. And I want to make that very, very clear. What we have already started witnessing in Colorado is that it didn't have an immediate impact on the practice of prison slavery because that's decided by the legislature and the Department of Corrections. But what we're noticing, especially in Colorado, is that there's an open door for litigation, and that is being explored right now in Colorado, making it the first case of its kind to try Department of Corrections and Core Civic for the practice of slavery under a constitution that now affirmatively opposes slavery and involuntary servitude. So we're hoping that this opens the door for so much more litigation, so much more legislation. It's the first of many steps on a longer staircase.
Thank you so much, Kamau. I mean, I think that's so brilliant, right, as a strategy. The reality is that the 14th Amendment, which gave folks, right, the right to equal protection under the law, didn't actually make everything equal that day, right, when it was passed or when it was ratified. What really happened is it gave a claim, it gave a right that could then be litigated on. And I think, the work that the Abolish Slavery National Network is doing is going to be just as powerful as that 14th Amendment. So thank you so much, Kamau. To learn more about Kamau's work, please follow the Abolish Slavery National Network on Facebook and visit our website at abolishslavery.us. We'd like to remind everyone that you can share questions in the chat on YouTube or Facebook, or by using the hashtag #PunishmentProfit on Twitter. We'll be taking your questions at the end of the program. Our final guest is Andrew Free. Andrew is an abolitionist, immigration, and civil rights attorney focused on corporate and government transparency and accountability. He founded and leads the Detention Kills Network, a mutual aid network that organizes, supports, and centers immigrants and refugees who have loved ones in immigration detention. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Bianca. It's nice to be here.
So we've heard a lot about slavery, or also, referred to as forced labor in prisons and jails tonight. But sadly, they are not the only places where slavery still exists. And immigration detention centers are yet another. In 2018, you brought a lawsuit along with some others against Core Civic, a private prison corporation that pays detained immigrants $1 a day to work in their detention centers. Can you tell us more about this case and what made you bring it?
Sure thing. So as you pointed out, the immigration detention space is a space where we know what happens when slavery has been formally abolished and you're not allowed to engage in enslaving people, but we know that it also happens anyway. So that's why we brought the case in 2018 alongside Project South and the Southern Poverty Law Center and some private firms, including mine. Three brave men, Wilhelm, Margarito, and Schwab, who were imprisoned at CoreCivic's Stewart Detention Center in Lumpkin, Georgia, which is the largest adult facility that CoreCivic had at the time, and is now America's most deadly ICE detention facility. 7 people have died since 2017. And what they claim at the heart of their complaint is this idea that no jail, no for-profit company can operate at a profit without the labor of the people inside. And consequently, they're going to do what they need to do, they being CoreCivic in this case. GEO has been sued, as has Akima Global Services, and there are a total of 10 lawsuits. But the basic theme is that these companies are going to do what they need to do to ensure their bottom line. As part of the scheme, the plaintiffs allege that the company denies people at Stewart basic necessities like soap, toilet paper, potable water, sufficient food, and other basic things. And then, so that creates the market for the commissary. It creates the need. So for instance, if you were to work in the kitchen or you to work in the laundry, you might work for 4 or 5 days in order to make like a 5-minute phone call. And sometimes that phone call is what stands between you and freedom. Just as Jorge was talking about with the parole programs in immigration detention centers, sometimes what you need is to be able to talk to people, and that is not always free. And so it creates this scarcity. On the other side of the incentives list is the threat of solitary confinement. And as Schwab Ahmed, one of the class representatives, experienced, if you decide you're going to stop working or you tell other people to stop working in the voluntary work program, you're sent to the hole, you're sent to solitary confinement. And so based on these facts, this deprivation scheme and the use of force and threats of force and abusive process, we contend that CoreCivic engages in unjust enrichment in violation of Georgia law and forced labor in violation of the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And so we sued. It hit a chord with the company, which might be why they sued right back and countersued the plaintiffs for the cost of their incarceration, for which ICE had already paid them millions of dollars.
Wow. Yeah. As if like that person wanted to be there and should be charged for their time there. I want to hone in on this like forced labor claim, right? And a lot of detention operators are saying that people inside are choosing to work. And this argument is very similar to that argument that people in prison choose some jobs over others. And so this choice means that folks are no longer, in essence, like forced to work. And so while in many cases, people are forced to work actually under threat of solitary confinement or loss of calls and visits, which we know is true if you don't work at all, there are even more nuanced ways that administrators force people to work. And that's through that deprivation that you sort of talked about a bit, which, feels, I think, really particularly difficult. And I'm wondering if you could just say a few more words about that so people can really understand how deprivation itself can be a way in which people are forced to work.
Sure thing. Well, one thing we have to keep in mind is that all of the options that are available to people, whether it be sitting in your dorm or your cell doing nothing, or potentially going to the law library and working on your case because that's why you're there, or working to benefit and profit the company that profits from your incarceration. Those are all options that are controlled and set by your jailer, by your captor. And so we understand that these violence and brute force tactics, like the whole and so-called uses of force, which is just a euphemism for beating somebody up or spraying them down, those are tools to keep a steady stream of compliance. But when you hear people inside and you understand what incentives they're grappling with as they make these decisions, it's sometimes, in my experience, it's often a lot more subtle. So that violence is always there in the background in your daily lives. But in order to understand how the scheme works, you have to understand the choice that you're being put to when it's so-called voluntary work program. Your choice, in essence, is you work for your captors for free, you work for them for $1 a day, sometimes $4 a day if you're working in the kitchen, sometimes $8 if you work a triple shift, which just tells you that they need the labor and they're pricing the labor as a market. So you do that in order to provide yourself with basic necessities that they should be providing you, that they're withholding, or you refuse to work. and maybe you tell other people to refuse to work, and then you face discipline. What happens when publicly traded companies like CoreCivic and Geo depend for their profitability, which is to say their survival, on generating earnings and dividends, is that the objects of the prison plantation model are no longer crops or manufactured goods, but they're marginal returns every quarter. And while the founder of CoreCivic can be seen in Shane Bauer's book overseeing one of those Texas cotton plantations that was a modern legal enslavement, that's not what they do now. And so right now what they do is they skim margins, all purportedly legally, by cutting out the amount that they're going to spend on things like food and sick call and subsidizing phone calls, and then forcing folks into a prison economy. So it's subtle, but it's not invisible, and it's felt in the daily lives of people that we speak with inside these DHS cages every day. What we see is that the people hold the keys. Those folks, they use every tool at their disposal to ensure that they do as little of the work as possible to operate the cages in which these folks suffer. And that's not right. That's why we have to end these practices.
Yeah, that's, I think it's so important for people to understand what is a true choice and what's not a true choice, right? And in these particular facilities, in these places. In just the last minute here, Andrew, you've been making something really abundantly clear, right? Which is that there are more similarities and there are differences between people incarcerated in prisons and jails and those detained in immigration detention centers. Yet the criminal justice and immigration justice movements have been largely divided. Can you tell us sort of a little bit about why that is? And more importantly, like, what should we do? What would you like to see happen? And we have just a 60 seconds or so here before we turn to the next segment.
At bottom, we just have to remember that division is by design. The system knows that if we unify the people in the cages and show that there are more differences, more similarities than differences, we are stronger, we are more organized, we are more powerful together, and we can topple that system. It's interesting because the criminal justice space operates and decarcerates, and then all of a sudden those empty jails in Louisiana become 7,800 new immigration detention beds. Conversely, when we walk into our movement spaces and we say, these aren't criminals, they're civilly detained people, we serve that same idea that is being served by that toxic, violent language of criminal, which is another way of saying a person who can be enslaved under the 13th Amendment. And by, kind of propping it up and accepting that frame, both that illegal immigrants, undocumented people without status are expendable and disposable to this country, and that quote unquote criminals are irredeemable and worthy of being put into cages, we serve the system that's trying to destroy both. And so what we have to do is think of, how do the people who are inside these cages help to rebuild with people who are outside communities of care that respond to the problems that prisons are supposed to address nominally with care and not with violence, and with dignity and not with the sort of enslavement that we see in all these spaces today.
Andrew, thank you so much for your work. And to follow Andrew's work, please follow him on Twitter at FolksMove or ImCivil Rights. If you haven't yet, now's the time to drop your questions into the chat on YouTube and Facebook, or on Twitter using the hashtag #PunishmentProfit. But before we jump into the Q&A, here are some of my takeaways from this week's discussion about programs and labor. At Worth Rises, we do a lot of work on telecom. And when we reveal that states and counties are collecting kickbacks from prison telecom corporations off of these calls, the first comeback from elected officials is always, but these kickbacks pay for programs. I just heard a local county board supervisor in San Diego say this afternoon. And, I just want to note as a side note, this afternoon, San Diego became the third city in the US to make jail phone calls entirely free. But my response when I hear this commentary is always, so clearly you think programs are important if you're going to use them as the reason for exploiting families. And I bet that you'd say to me as an advocate that one of the purposes of putting people in prison is rehabilitation. And most electeds agree. And so then I ask them, then why would you not include the cost of programs in your general operating budget for your correctional facilities? Why are programs so trivial that your government won't pay for them? See, as we discussed today, programs are the first operating cost on the chopping block when budgets get cut. And it reveals so much about the sincerity of elected officials in our criminal legal system. But so does the idea that labor is a program. We hear people say things like, people are learning skills. And then I wonder, does it take 25 years to learn how to manufacture a license plate? At what point is the apprenticeship over, and are we just abusing free labor? See, in 1949, Germany abolished the death penalty. After the war, the government decided that the terror its predecessors had waged on Jewish people made the clearest case that it could never kill again. But in the United States, the realization of our original sin, of the time when we terrorized Black people, was not so clear, and our apology has not been so sincere. We passed the 13th Amendment with a loophole to keep doing what we had always done. See, as planned, we introduced Black codes that criminalized Black life, and within months, people were enslaved back on the same plantations from which they had just been freed, but now with the justification of the label criminal. From there, we saw convict leasing become the norm, and it provided Southern states with as much as 75% of their revenue. And though the practice of convict leasing has been eliminated and reintroduced over the course of the last 150 years, the subjugation of incarcerated people who are disproportionately Black and brown under forced labor regimes by the government persists today. Today, the largest employer of incarcerated people is not a major corporation, though there is still a significant private sector footprint, but it is the government. Government is using incarcerated people to address emergencies like COVID and solve budget gaps. You know, recently in the past year, we saw New York under Governor Cuomo using incarcerated labor to manufacture hand sanitizer that was not available to people inside themselves. We saw over 40 other states similarly using incarcerated labor to manufacture masks and gowns for hospitals. We've also seen states using incarcerated labor over other emergencies like California and the wildfires. And we've seen states use incarcerated labor to have revenue projects, like New York's project to redesign its license plates, which was intended to essentially create new revenue for the state by forcing everyone to get a new license plate, a project that only created revenue because the people manufacturing those license plates are incarcerated and being paid just pennies an hour. And just to be clear, because we know everyone's curious, yes, there are still corporations involved in prisons and jails. They are in our supply chains. Corporations like 3M are not just using direct labor, but also supplying the metals and the laminates used for things like license plates or other types of products manufactured inside of prisons. The federal regulation of private sector use is limited to products that cross state lines, which means products that stay inside a state don't count. Services that are inside a state or services at all are actually not regulated. So you may have seen the headline news that Mayor Bloomberg, or former Mayor Bloomberg, made when he was running for office and found out that his campaign calls were coming from inside of a facility, not regulated. Agriculture, not regulated. And this brings me to an important comment and point that Andrew was making, which is around this notion of our movements and the unity or division of our movements. For those who may not be aware, agriculture, 70% of labor in agriculture is estimated to be undocumented. How we get our fruits and vegetables into our refrigerators is coming largely from undocumented labor. And when the last administration started the Zero Tolerance Initiative, that program essentially dried up undocumented labor and moved a lot of farms into prisons. So much of our economy doesn't see the difference between undocumented labor and prison labor. And that's how a lot of it comes into our space. And so I ask you to sort of ask yourself, is there ever a situation in which enslaving someone is okay? Could you ever say, under conditions X, Y, and Z, enslaving this person is appropriate? If not, then it's time you join the movement to eliminate the exception to the 13th Amendment in not just the US Constitution, but every state constitution, so that we can abolish slavery once and for all. And with that, I'd like to bring back all of our guests to answer some of your questions. So we are collecting your questions. Hi, everyone. We're back on our screen. So I am looking at questions coming in now. Apologies. Yes, can we talk? I'm going to throw this question over to Andrew. This is for you. Getting a question in from, excuse me if I don't pronounce your name perfectly, Santanik Margarian. Can we talk about how counties are benefiting from immigration detention? How actually the detention of immigrants in the system and through ICE is actually creating a cash flow for counties?
Sure. I'll start with the one that's currently at the top of my mind, which is Irwin County, Georgia. Irwin County, Georgia operates the Irwin County Detention Center, which saw a move to bring in non-citizens or suspected non-citizens and profit with the LaSalle Corrections Corporation. And what happened was that the county hospital, the county commission, the county jail, and some doctors who were in business with all those people ended up harvesting profits from the bodies of women who were incarcerated there, predominantly Black and brown women, and ended up sterilizing a significant number of them. It wasn't because they were attempting specifically to engage in a genocide against that population. It was because it was super easy to do and it was super profitable. And that's just one example. It's not that Irwin is every single county jail, but to some extent, the sort of profits that you can reap when you bring these Black and brown bodies in, after the state legislature has said we're not going to criminalize those folks, and particularly when folks are not seen as having a stake in our political community, it opens it up for local governments to engage in all sorts of exploitation, including medical abuse, but more frequently, assisting with various things that the county needs to do, just for its functioning. So.
Thank you, Andrew. This next question is from Allison. I'm going to throw this question to you, Amani. The question is about, in terms of the demands that were being made inside for programs, was there also involved in that discussion a question of what those programs should be, some form of like education aspects, and how did that conversation emerge? Amani, you're mute.
So the demands themselves were whittled down from 35 all the way down to 10, just to make it succinct and something that was national, that could be relatable across every state that was participating. So when it comes down to exactly what types of programs were needed, that wasn't specifically included in the demands in order to give participants the ability to make it flexible for their state. Some states had college courses while others didn't. Some states offered to pay through Pell Grants while others didn't. So it wasn't specific to that degree. However, when it comes to the types of programs, I like to turn it back and say, we need to be asking people in prison what it is that they want, what it is that they need. Why not take a poll? Why not take a survey of all the folks that are incarcerated at a facility and ask them, what do you guys want here? Do you need a cooking program? Would you like more than just weights out on the yard? Would you like a parenting program? There are a lot of college courses and students who would love to come in and share some of the work that they're doing and do partnership programs. I know where I was studying at the University of Washington, we had a partnership program where we would take classes in conjunction side by side with people who are incarcerated while they were earning credits as well. So there's a very wide variety of what can be offered. And I wouldn't want to whittle it down to something specific that every single person on the inside wants, because just as all of our college campuses offer different courses and curriculums, I think that our prisons and jails can look quite similar and offer a wide variety of courses and curriculums that apply to that population that can serve them in the best way.
Thank you, Amani. So I'm going to toss this last question just because we are running out of time to Jorge. Jorge, the question As a follow-up, do juvenile detention centers also engage in minor forms of prison labor and prison slavery abuse?
I'm pretty good at ducking questions that I don't know. And never having been locked up as a juvenile, I don't know. Yeah, that would have to be something that maybe Jessica Sandoval could tell you something, but I couldn't. But since you did give me the opportunity, I want to kind of riff a little bit on what Amani just said. And prisons are meant to punish. And to actually say that we're going to offer you a program that's going to quote unquote rehabilitate you, right? Well, define rehabilitation, right? What are the metrics for that? What are the measures for that? What are we going to give you to make you a decent, quote, law-abiding, productive member of society, right? That I couldn't have given you in the damn world without sending you to the most brutal institution I can think of to make you take it. So it just the entire idea of programs in prison, I'm sorry, as you can tell, kind of rings a bell for me. So I'll go now and I'll let you ask other questions. I ducked that one.
No, but I think that's so important. And I think that is, a large part of what we want to land tonight, right? Is that prisons are not meant to rehabilitate people, no matter what excuses are made by elected officials about the importance of funding for programs, all that. The reality is that that's not what's happening inside of our facility. It's not what they were designed to do. The carceral crisis that we have today was born in large part off of the failure in our country to actually ever abolish slavery. And so with that, I want to say thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for tonight as we're starting to run a little bit over. I want to thank all of our guests so much for joining us tonight, Jorge, Amani, Kamau, and Andrew, and thank you to all of you at home for joining us again. We'll be back next week at the same time, Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, to talk about equipment. For those who want to keep tonight's conversation going, to ask more questions or share your reflections, please join me and Brianna Gibson, Director of Campaigns at Worth Rises, as we head over to Clubhouse for our public study group. Follow me, Bianca Tylik, to fund the room. And if you'd like to learn more about our work at Worth Rises, please check us out on Worth Rises at worthrises.org and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Worth Rises. I'm Bianca Tylik. Have a good night.